It was in the early weeks of April, during that strange interlude between the fading chill of winter and the first true breath of spring, that the case began. A case so curious and laden with contradictions that even Holmes, seasoned in the grotesque and improbable, was momentarily stilled upon hearing the particulars. I remember the morning well. The fog had rolled in off the Thames with unusual vigor, casting Baker Street in a thick, pale shroud. It clung to the windows and muffled the sound of distant hoofbeats, making the world feel unervingly silent. Holmes was at the breakfast table, engrossed not in eggs or toast but in the Times, which he perused with his usual keenness. I had just returned from a brisk walk and was warming my hands by the fire when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a Lady Celestine Blackbriar. The name meant nothing to me at the time, but it evidently did to Holmes, who looked up sharply and folded his paper with a snap. "Lady Blackbriar?" he said. "Show her in at once, Mrs. Hudson. And bring tea." Moments later, the woman entered our sitting room in a rustle of dark velvet. She was tall, statuesque, and pale in the way of one long untroubled by sun or common hardship. Her eyes, however, betrayed a disquiet, a flickering unrest that suggested sleepless nights and more questions than answers. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft but brittle, "thank you for receiving me without notice. You arrive unannounced, milady, which often signals either extreme urgency or supreme arrogance. I suspect in your case it is the former." She inclined her head, perhaps unsure whether she had been insulted or flattered. "The situation is impossible, Mr. Holmes," she said. "And yet it has occurred. My brother is dead. Killed in a locked room. Alone. Without a mark upon him. And surrounded by," she faltered slightly, "by roses." Holmes steepled his fingers. Roses? Not vases of them. They were growing through the walls, through the floorboards, thorns in the curtains, petals on the ceiling. A veritable jungle of them, blooming violently overnight. And now he lies at the center of it, untouched, uncut, and very much dead. I must admit that at this I even shifted forward in my seat. Holmes' eyes glittered. "And where did this miracle of botany occur?" he asked. "At our ancestral home, Dunlock Abbey in Surrey. It is an old place, as you may know. Cold stone, long shadows, accursed past, suitable for novels but inconvenient for the living. My brother, Lord Edmund Blackbriar, was the last of his line. And the room was locked from the inside?" "Yes, bolted. Windows shuttered and sealed. No hidden panels that we could detect, no secret passageways. I do not exaggerate when I say that it is an impossibility. You have brought the police into the matter?" "Inspector Harrington from the local constabulary. A stout man, well-meaning but entirely baffled. He believes it must be poison, though no vial was found, no trace left in the body. A physicien examiné de Jimon no bruising, no punctures, no abrasions. It is as though he simply lay down among the roses, and expired." Holmes rose and paced to the window, where the fog still loomed like a quiet threat. He remained silent for a time. "Did your brother have enemies?" he asked finally. "Not enemies precisely," she said. "But he had secrets. Edmund was always peculiar. After our parents died, he withdrew into books, botany, and the occult. He spoke often of blood in the roots and the thorns that remember. I took it for madness or poetic affectation." Holmes turned abruptly. "And these roses, have you kept them intact?" "They began to wither almost immediately after dawn, as though their life had ended with his. Some remain blackened and dry. I had the room sealed." "Watson," Holmes said, reaching for his coat. "Cancel any engagement you might have today. It appears we are bound for Dunlock Abbey. But what do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. "Roses growing overnight in a sealed room? It defies all logic." "That is precisely why it interests me," Holmes replied, his tone sharp with anticipation. "Nature does not operate in the irrational. If a curtain has grown thorns, it is not the curtain that lies. Something else is festering beneath the surface, and I intend to unearth it." Lady Blackbriar rose, clutching her gloves with trembling fingers. "Then you believe there is a rational explanation?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that the more impossible a crime appears, the more mundane its mechanism tends to be, once properly illuminated." We set off before noon, the mist thickening as we departed, wrapping itself around our hansom like a living shroud. In the distance I fancied I could already smell roses. Not the pleasant, delicate fragrance of a summer bloom, but something deeper, stranger. Heavy. Cloying. And so began one of the most bewildering cases Holmes and I had ever encountered, the case of the curtain that grew thorns. Chapter 2, First Whispers at Baker Street. By the time we returned to Baker Street after accompanying Lady Blackbriar to her waiting carriage, the fog had thickened to such a degree that even the lamplighter had become a spectral silhouette in the gloom. The gaslight outside our rooms cast no warmth, only an eerie orange glow upon the cobblestones. Holmes lit his pipe with more relish than usual and settled into the armchair beside the fire, his long fingers steepled before him in contemplative stillness. I meanwhile occupied myself with sharpening a pencil and opening my notebook, more out of habit than necessity. Because the ivy is torn where someone forced entry, or exit, through a narrow slit just above. That tells me someone has already attempted to investigate from the outside, or perhaps, someone wished to escape notice. Before I could press him further, the carriage rolled to a stop. We were met by a stiff, barrel-chested man with ruddy cheeks and thick, graying eyebrows, Inspector Harrington no doubt. "Mr. Holmes?" he said, offering a brisk nod. "And Dr. Watson. You're welcome, though I warn you, you won't find much to work with. It's a damned riddle, and I've half a mind to blame it on old Blackbriar madness." "Let us reserve madness for last, Inspector," Holmes said with a faint smile. "Lead us to the scene." Lady Celestine Blackbriar awaited us in the grand entryway, draped once more in dark velvet. She gave us a silent nod and led us through a series of cold, echoing halls until we reached a narrow spiral staircase that led to the eastern wing. "The room remains untouched," she said. "Only Inspector Harrington has entered, and he disturbed as little as possible." Holmes offered a curt nod of approval. The door to Lord Edmund's chamber was a heavy oak thing, bolted on the inside and showing no sign of forced entry. Harrington produced the key and unlocked it, revealing a room that might have belonged to a monk. Plain stone walls, high ceilings, a desk cluttered with books and a narrow bed by the shuttered window. And the roses. They were everywhere. Though their brilliance had dulled and browned, their presence was unmistakable. Thorned vines curled through the wooden slats of the shutters, having forced their way through the tiniest of cracks. Petals lay in wilted clusters across the floor. A thick bundle of stems had burst through the fireplace, grating like some coiled serpent. And strangest of all, the curtain near the bed, an old brocade affair, was torn from top to bottom, the edges stiff with dried sap, as if actual thorns had grown from the very fabric. Holmes said nothing for several long minutes. He moved slowly through the room, gloved fingers trailing near but never quite touching anything. He crouched by the curtain, studied the desk, examined the fire grate with intense scrutiny. Then he stood over the body of Lord Edmund Blackbriar. The corpse was pale, lips slightly parted as though surprised in his final moment. There was no blood. No signs of struggle. He lay atop the bedsheet, fully dressed in a linen shirt and dark trousers, hands folded as though in repose. Holmes gestured for me. "Observe, Watson. Note the fingertips." I bent down and peered. "There's dirt beneath the nails?" "Indeed. And what do you make of that? That he had been in the garden recently? Or that he struggled to remove something before he died? Both possibilities. Yet I wonder, why is there soil under the nails of a man who reportedly locked himself in for the night? And why is the soil flecked with black ash?" Holmes turned to Harrington. "Has the fireplace been used recently?" "No, sir. It's cold as stone. The maid said Lord Edmund hadn't lit it in weeks." Holmes crouched by the grate again and, producing his magnifying glass, studied the vines that had grown through it. "Curious," he murmured. "Extremely curious." He stood and walked to the desk. Upon it lay a journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. He flipped through a few pages. Latin phrases, botanical drawings, notations that grew more erratic as they neared the end. "Rosa obscura," Holmes read aloud. "Sanguis ex radicibus, blood from the roots. And here, she sleeps in thorns and I with her." A reference, perhaps, to some imagined lover or muse. Or something more ominous. Lady Celestine stood silently by the doorway, her face unreadable. "Your brother, did he ever mention anyone named Livia?" Holmes asked suddenly. Her eyes flickered just slightly. "Livia? No. Not in my hearing." Holmes did not press her, but I noted the slight narrowing of his eyes. He returned to the curtain, now half hung and stiff with dried thorns. "Would you say this curtain is original to the room?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It's been there for decades. I believe it belonged to our grandfather." "Then how," Holmes said softly, "has a species of vine native to South America embedded itself within its fabric?" No one answered. Holmes made a final slow circuit of the room, pausing once to test the latch on the shuttered window, which held firm. Then he straightened, brushing dust from his knees. "Well," he said at last, "we have witnessed the scene. A man, locked in a room, surrounded by roses that should not be here, exhibiting no cause of death save for circumstance. A curtain that has grown thorns, and a corpse with dirty fingernails and ash beneath the soil." He turned to the inspector. "I take it, Harrington, there are no footprints outside the window, no evidence of climbing?" "None," the man said flatly. "Then the question is not how someone got in," Holmes mused, "but how something got out." And with that enigmatic remark, he strode from the room, leaving us to follow through the echoing corridors of Dunlock Abbey, while the thorn-strewn chamber behind us seemed to grow colder still. Chapter 4: The Gathering of Suspects. By early afternoon, the air inside Dunlock Abbey had taken on the stillness of a mausoleum. It was not merely the hush of ancient stone or the damp quiet of a countryside manor, it was a hush that pressed inward, carrying the weight of something unspoken. Even the very servants moved with a certain unease, glancing behind them as though the house itself had grown eyes. Holmes, having concluded his preliminary inspection of Lord Edmund's chamber, requested that all those present in the house on the night of the death be assembled in the eastern drawing-room. "There is something to be learned," he said, "not just in what people say but in how they wait to say it." The drawing-room was a wide, high-ceilinged space lined with books and faded portraits. The fireplace was unlit, and the smell of old paper clung to the drapes. Holmes positioned himself by the hearth, arms folded, while I stood a pace behind, notebook in hand. Inspector Harrington stood to one side, stiff-backed, clearly skeptical but silent. One by one they arrived. The first was Mr. Julian Armitage, a distant cousin of the Blackbriars and, according to Lady Celestine, the only remaining male relative. He was a man of 35, well-dressed, with pale hands and a nervous habit of smoothing his mustache. His eyes darted frequently to Holmes, then away again as though unsure how to look at a man reputed to see through souls. Following him was Miss Beatrice Langley, Edmund's personal secretary. She was a slight, pinched woman in her late 20s, with ink-stained fingers and an expression caught halfway between fear and fatigue. She kept her eyes on her boots as she entered and muttered a brief greeting before retreating into the far corner. Next came Mr. Oswald Grange, the groundskeeper, thick-set, with weather-beaten features and boots that tracked in flecks of earth. He glanced around the room with mild suspicion, then folded his arms and leaned against the wall as though daring someone to question him. Then there was Mrs. Flora Greaves, the longtime housekeeper. A widow with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, she moved like a clockwork figure, precise and careful. Her mouth was thin, her posture erect, but there was a flicker in her eyes I could not interpret, grief or wariness, perhaps both. Lastly came Father Ambrose, the village priest, a gaunt man in his 60s with sharp features and a gaze that never quite rested anywhere for long. He carried with him a faint scent of candle wax and incense, and his hands were stained with ink and tobacco. Lady Celestine remained nearby, watching all with the impassivity of a painted statue. Holmes surveyed them for a moment in silence before speaking. "I thank you all for coming. I will not waste your time with unnecessary formalities. You are aware that Lord Edmund Blackbriar is dead under circumstances which, at first glance, defy reason. I believe reason is very much alive here, it merely hides under layers of performance." A few of them shifted uncomfortably. "I have some questions and I encourage candor. I am not here as a policeman, nor will I pass judgment. But I will find the truth." He turned first to Mr. Armitage. "You are a cousin of the deceased?" "Yes, sir." "Third cousin on the maternal line?" Edmund and I were not particularly close, but I visited once a month. Family obligation, you understand." "Were you here the night of his death?" I'd arrived that morning. I was staying in the West Wing, nowhere near Edmund's chambers." Holmes nodded. "And your relationship with Lady Celestine?" Armitage hesitated. "We are cordial. She manages the estate's finances. I stay out of such matters." Holmes made no comment. He turned to Miss Langley. "You were Lord Edmund's secretary. What sort of work did you undertake for him?" She looked up at last, her voice soft and brittle. "Transcription mostly. Notes from his journals. Letters to botanists. Cataloging seeds and specimens. He was very particular about order." "Was he in good spirits recently?" "No," she said. He'd grown strange. He was obsessed with the roses. Spoke to them sometimes. Said they remembered things. That they would protect him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Protect him from what?" She shook her head. "He never said. But he was afraid. Not of anyone here, but of something older. Something in the roots. A murmur stirred the room. Holmes turned next to Mr. Grange. "You are the groundskeeper?" "Aye," he said. 15 years. "Did Lord Edmund have a private garden?" Grange grunted. "He did. Behind the abbey, fenced off. Nobody but him had a key. Grew strange plants there. Nasty things with barbs and creeping vines. Said they needed peace. Said they spoke to each other." "Did he ever harvest them?" "Not that I saw. Justivating. Sometimes at night." Holmes glanced at me as if filing something away. He moved on to Mrs. Greaves. "You manage the staff?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes." "Did Lord Edmund ever dismiss servants unexpectedly?" "No. But many left of their own accord. They didn't like the East Wing. Said it was listening." "Listening?" "They said they heard whispers. When no one was there." Holmes was silent for a moment, then turned at last to Father Ambrose. "You knew the family long?" "Since before Celestine was born. I baptized them both." "Had Lord Edmund consulted you recently?" "Yes. A week before his death. He asked me about sacrilege." Holmes' brow rose. "What sort of sacrilege?" The priest looked uncomfortable. "He said he'd violated something beneath the soil. That he had unearthed a thing best left buried. I advised him to rest. He did not take it well." Holmes folded his arms. "Interesting." He allowed the silence to settle again, letting the weight of the room build. "Thank you all. For now you may go." They filed out slowly, none speaking, though all stole glances at one another. As the door shut behind the last of them, I turned to Holmes. "Well?" "A collection of liars, the lot of them," he murmured. "Some lie by omission, others by nature. But one thing is certain, someone in that room knows exactly what killed Lord Edmund Blackbriar." Chapter 5. First suspects the red herring. The morning after our initial interviews, I awoke in a room that seemed to breathe with the abbey itself, drafty, shadowed, and far too still. Holmes had risen long before me, and when I descended to the east drawing-room, I found him hunched over a small table littered with plant clippings, ashes, and a thin trail of soil. He did not look up as I entered. "Watson," he murmured, "what do you make of this?" I bent closer. Before him were 3 distinct samples, each laid carefully on white handkerchiefs. One appeared to be a shriveled black stem with thorns so fine they could scarcely be seen. Another was a brittle cluster of rose petals, now almost entirely gray. The third, and most curious, was a strand of fabric, likely from the brocade curtain, pierced cleanly through by a thorn. "They appear mundane enough," I said cautiously. "But I presume you found them in Lord." In the guest register, I found mention of a certain Professor Godfrey Wilmot, who supposedly visited Thornwood Abbey 3 months ago to advise Lord Edmund on rare botanical cultivars. Miss Langley referenced him in one of her logs. Yet I cannot find any correspondence from this Wilmot in the household files. Not a single letter or reply. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And you suspect the professor never existed?" "Either that or he was not who he claimed to be." Holmes stood, brushing specks of dried soil from his sleeve. "Watson, you astonish me. I had reached the same conclusion regarding that name last night. But your deduction confirms it. There is no Wilmot at Cambridge, Oxford, or any continental botanical society. I wrote to several last week after reviewing the logs." "Then who was he?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must now determine." We descended into the old cellar shortly after supper. Holmes had received word from Mrs. Penley, the housekeeper, that some of Lord Edmund's private items had been stored down there after his death. She had refused to enter the space herself, citing an ill smell and strange movement in the shadows. We brought lanterns. The light flickered against stone walls, casting long jerking shadows over barrels, old portraits, and forgotten trunks. The air was thick and damp, tinged with mildew, and something else. "Smell that?" I asked. "Rotting vegetation?" Holmes nodded, moving ahead. "Something organic has been stored here. Recently." He found the trunk in question tucked behind a barrel of cracked sherry bottles. It bore Edmund's initials but had been hastily shut with a rusted latch. Holmes pried it open. Inside, among the expected clutter, torn notebooks, seed packets, and sketchbooks, we discovered something startling. A journal. Its cover was bound in worn green leather, the pages thick and ink-smudged. Holmes flipped to the center and read aloud. "August 14th. She responded again today." The blood coaxed the bloom further. I heard it whisper beneath the soil. "She sees through the petals now." I shuddered. He was mad. Holmes didn't answer immediately. "Not necessarily. Delusional, perhaps. But madness implies fabrication. What if he truly saw something? He turned to another entry. August 27th. Godfrey warned me. Said I was digging into memory itself. But he fears what I welcome. These roses were not meant for beauty. They remember the soil they came from. They know. Godfrey again, I said. So he existed, but was using a false name? Or it was an alias Edmund invented to mask another advisor. Someone who didn't want to be known. Holmes paused, then suddenly rifled through the rest of the trunk. He pulled out a bundle of letters tied with crimson thread, odd as the others were bound with twine or string. These were different. The envelopes bore no postage. All were signed only with the letter M. Curious, Holmes muttered. M. No surname. No seal. He opened one and read silently, his expression tightening. Well? I asked. They are instructions. Detailed ones. How to distill a compound from the rose's sap. Directions to treat the roots with a particular solution to awaken the buried code. Code? I echoed. Possibly metaphorical. Possibly not. I felt a chill creep down my spine. But these letters, how did they arrive if there's no postage? They must have been hand-delivered. Someone local. We both froze at the thought. Someone from within the abbey, or the nearby village, had been guiding Lord Edmund's bizarre experiments in secret. Possibly still watching. Back in the warmth of the parlor, Holmes sat in thought, the journal open across his lap. I poured us both tea, though he ignored his cup. There is one thing we must do now, Watson, he said quietly. We must find the identity of M. And to do that, we'll need to consult someone who saw more than they understood. The staff. Better, Holmes said. The youngest servant, someone whose innocence may have been their best disguise. He rose, suddenly animated. Fetch me young Thomas, the stable boy. He delivers the post and sometimes runs errands to the village. If someone was sneaking letters past the household, he may have noticed more than he knows. I found Thomas in the stables, brushing down one of the mares. A wiry lad of about 14, with freckles and ears that stuck out like shutters. He looked frightened when I asked him to come speak with Mr. Holmes. But he obeyed. Inside, Holmes greeted him gently, motioning for him to sit. Thomas, he said kindly, have you ever seen anyone visiting Lord Edmund late in the evening? Perhaps someone delivering letters or packages, someone who didn't use the front door. Thomas fidgeted. Maybe. I did see someone once just before harvest time. Black coat. Hat pulled low. Came round the west side near the rose garden. Didn't use the bell. Did Edmund meet him? No, sir. I think he left something in the garden. Just dropped it into the flower bed and walked off. Quick as anything. Holmes leaned forward. Do you remember anything else about him? Thomas nodded. He limped, sir. Not badly, but one leg dragged. Holmes sat back, satisfied. Thank you, Thomas. You've helped more than you know. As the boy departed, Holmes murmured, now we search for a limping man, possibly local, who signs with him, and trades in unnatural knowledge. The roots of this case, Watson, are deep indeed. Chapter 7. The visitor in the foggy shadow returns. That night, the mist returned, thicker and colder than before. It rolled in over the hills like a living thing, coiling through the hedgerows and pressing against the windows of Thornwood Abbey with silent insistence. Even the hearths seemed to burn more dimly, as though the fog were reaching inward, dampening flame and thought alike. Chapter 8. The Langley Ledger Secrets of the Past. The following morning arrived grim and gray. The fog had receded somewhat, but a heaviness clung to the air, as if the house itself had absorbed the dread of the previous night. Holmes rose early and summoned me to the breakfast room before the rest of the household stirred. I have requested access to the family archives, he said, buttering a slice of toast with surgical precision. If our adversary clings to the idea of bloodlines and cycles, then the key may lie not in modern letters, but in the records of the past. Do you believe the Langleys have harbored this practice for generations? I asked. Not necessarily. He took a bite. But someone does. Whether it began as myth, madness, or misinterpretation of scientific lore, it has rooted itself in this family and in this soil. We must uncover the seed. Helena met us in the library shortly thereafter, visibly exhausted but resolute. The archives are behind the study, she said. They've not been organized in years, I'm afraid. You'll find ledgers, journals, correspondence, anything the Langleys thought worthy of keeping. We followed her into a narrow hallway, at the end of which stood an iron-bound door. She produced a brass key from around her neck. This hasn't been opened in over a decade, she murmured. With a turn of the key, the door creaked open, revealing a chamber of forgotten history. Dust hung thick in the air, and the scent of paper and mildew filled our nostrils. Shelves lined the walls, some bowed with the weight of ancient tomes, others littered with loose documents. Holmes immediately took to the far wall, his gaze scanning labels and bindings like a hawk. "What's in here?" he called after several minutes. I crossed to where he stood, peering over his shoulder. He held a thick volume labeled Langley Household Ledger, 1803 to 1830. Holmes set it on a table and opened it carefully. The entries were handwritten in an elegant but meticulous script. It appeared to be a record of house operations, notable visitors, finances, and, intriguingly, botanical experiments. Summer of 1811, rosebed expansion successful. Lady Margaret reported disturbances in dreams once more. Experiment number 14 continues, Holmes read aloud. Bleeding rose reverted to pale on equinox. I frowned. Bleeding rose? He flipped back several pages. Yes, here again, experiment number 9, crossbred from Eastern hybrid and native red. Responds to moonlight, water salinity, and blood. We stared at one another. Holmes closed the ledger slowly. This is no delusion of Edmund's alone. These so-called experiments have persisted for over a century. We continued our search, uncovering several more volumes, most of them dense with lists of Latin plant names, symbols, even strange diagrams of roots resembling human nerves. Then Holmes unearthed a small leather-bound journal, unmarked but well-worn. He opened it and skimmed a few pages. This belonged to Lady Margaret Langley, Helena's great-grandmother. Listen to this. He comes in the mist, trailing roses in his wake. I cannot see his face but I know his steps. The thorns part for him. I bleed in sleep yet wake whole. The garden speaks. It wants me again. He paused. Delirium? Or documentation? Possibly both, I said. Either she was mad, or being manipulated. Holmes turned another page, more careful now. Mother forbade the ritual, but the gardener whispered of the old vow. Edmund listens. He says it's just science. But the garden knows better. It is not science. It is hunger. Good God, I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. The gardener. Perhaps the first of many in the line. Perhaps M is his descendant, or the gardener himself, passed on only in title. Just then Helena entered quietly, her expression uncertain. You found something? Holmes destet vorherzusit. Lady Margaret kept a journal. In it, she describes experiments with roses that respond not only to traditional horticulture, but to something darker. Helena paled. She was institutionalized in her later years. My father said it was melancholia, but I remember hearing stories, children's warnings, never to walk among the roses at night. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever speak of a figure in the mist? A man the garden obeyed. Helena's brow furrowed. Yes, I remember something she used to say when I was very little. When the thorn man calls, shut your eyes and seal your lips. I thought it was nonsense. Not nonsense, Holmes said. A memory passed as rhyme. He stood, suddenly galvanized. We must speak to the current gardener. Helena hesitated. Mr. Pilcher? He's worked here only 5 years. Reclusive but harmless. Holmes was already moving. No one involved in the care of this garden can be assumed innocent, not until we understand what they tend. We found Mr. Pilcher in the southern greenhouse, trimming vines with deliberate care. He was a tall man, quiet and pale, with a cleft in his chin and eyes like cloudy glass. Holmes stepped inside first. Mr. Pilcher? The gardener looked up but did not speak. I'm Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I'm investigating certain events at Thornwood, particularly regarding the rose garden and its unusual cultivars. Still the man said nothing. Holmes continued. Are you familiar with the Langley rose experiments? A flicker passed across Pilcher's expression. He set down his shears. I tend the flowers, sir. That is all. But not all flowers are mere plants, are they? Holmes pressed. Some grow from older roots. Roots that carry memory, perhaps. Pilcher's lips parted, then closed again. Finally he spoke softly. I only do what I was told. The garden, it tells you what it needs if you listen. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Who told you? We're running out of time, Watson. This is no longer about uncovering history. It's about stopping a sacrifice. Chapter 10. Beneath the velvet veil, a voice in the garden. We carried Pilcher to a nearby bench in the cellar corridor, laying him gently upon it. His eyelids flickered, but he remained unconscious. Holmes knelt beside him, examining the ceremonial blade once more with grim focus. The hilt, shaped like intertwined rose vines, appeared worn in the grip, as though it had passed through many hands. "He was struck, not stabbed," Holmes muttered. "This blade was never meant for him. Someone interrupted a ritual, or sought to silence him before he revealed too much." Helena hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "But who would do this? And why leave him here? Why not dispose of him?" "To send a message," Holmes said, gesturing to the wall where the chilling words still dripped. "The garden does not forgive betrayal. Pilcher's usefulness has expired, but he was still part of their play. This," he motioned to the wall, "is a warning to us, Miss Fairfax." I turned to Holmes. "You said someone is orchestrating this ritual based on belief. But belief alone doesn't produce bloodied walls and stolen memories." "No," Holmes agreed. "It takes knowledge, access, and conviction. And someone within this estate, perhaps even within the Fairfax lineage, is ensuring that belief endures." We carried Pilcher upstairs and placed him under the supervision of Mrs. Hughes, who paled upon hearing what had happened but agreed to keep the household calm. Helena, though visibly shaken, was insistent on continuing the search. "There's a voice," she said softly as we stepped back into the corridor. "In the garden. Not a literal one, but a presence. Since childhood I felt it, especially in that place by the eastern hedgerow where the roses bloom unnaturally tall. Margaret once called it the Whispering Bend." Holmes turned toward her, eyes sharp. "Then it is time we visit that place." The sun was dipping low by the time we reached the outer gardens. A mist had begun to rise off the soil, mingling with the scent of damp roses. The greenhouse loomed behind us like a silent sentinel. We followed a narrow path that veered away from the cultivated flowerbeds, toward a secluded portion of the estate flanked by ancient stone walls. There, just as Helena described, stood an unnaturally tall arch of climbing roses. The branches twisted overhead in a natural tunnel, their blooms dark crimson bordering on black. Despite the time of year, they looked full and strangely alive, dew trembling on their velvet petals like sweat on skin. As we stepped beneath the boughs, the air changed. It grew colder, and with it came a strange hum, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the low tuning of a stringed instrument. Helena froze. "It's louder now," she whispered. "I used to think it was the wind through the leaves. But it isn't. It knows when someone walks here." Holmes moved slowly, examining the base of each thick stem. He traced the roots with gloved fingers, following their convergence beneath the earth toward a central patch where the ground appeared darker and disturbed. "Watson," he said, beckoning me. "Help me clear this." We knelt and began scraping away the damp mulch and leaves. Within minutes, the tips of a wooden frame emerged, a small hatch, weathered and moss-covered. Holmes pried it open with his cane, revealing a descending ladder, old but sturdy. Helena recoiled. "I never knew this existed." "Nor were you meant to," Holmes said grimly. "Whatever rituals your grandmother performed here, they were hidden not just in language but in layers of the estate." We descended carefully. The passage below was narrow, lined with old brick and overgrown with fine roots that clung to the walls like veins. The further down we went, the stronger the scent of rose oil grew, sickly, almost cloying. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a low chamber no larger than a modest pantry. Shelves lined the walls, holding vials, parchments, and more ceremonial blades, each bearing unique etchings. In the center was a circular basin, its base stained dark from age. Holmes examined the walls, brushing aside layers of grime to reveal carvings, words in Old English mingled with Latin. The same symbol of the serpent consuming itself was carved directly above the basin. Helena stared at it, visibly disturbed. "My grandmother wore that symbol around her neck. She said it reminded her that pain was a circle, always returning." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "It isn't just a ritual. It's an inheritance. Each generation must reawaken the garden's power. But to what end?" I stepped forward, pointing to a sheaf of papers on one of the shelves, a journal bound in rose-pink leather. Holmes flipped it open. The entries were brief, almost clinical. Spring 1885. The child would not bleed. The thorns did not close. Summer 1892. I was chosen. I did not resist. The roses flourished. Winter 1903. The voices return. The garden demands balance. Edmund's birth complicates the line. Holmes closed the journal. So Edmund was involved. From the beginning. Groomed, perhaps, to continue the rites. Helena shook her head. But he ran. He changed. He wanted nothing to do with Thornwood's legacy. Perhaps, Holmes said, but blood is a stubborn echo. And the garden remembers. A sudden creak above drew our attention. We looked up the passage but no figure stood there, just the faint sway of the hatch door as though it had been disturbed by an unseen hand. Holmes's face hardened. Someone knows we found this place. We ascended swiftly. The mist had thickened and shadows lengthened across the garden path. Back inside the manor, a silence had settled. We returned to the drawing room to find Mrs. Hughes alone. Pilcher had vanished. She clutched her apron. He was here one moment. Then gone. I only stepped away for a moment. Helena turned pale. He's going back. To the Roses. He thinks they'll forgive him. Holmes's eyes flashed. No. Someone led him there. And we have until nightfall to stop what they intend. Chapter 11. The roots beneath secrets never die. The night had settled heavily upon Thornwood Hall. A cold wind whispered against the stained-glass windows, rattling them in their leaden frames. Somewhere beyond the velvet drapes, the garden pulsed with silence, brooding and expectant. Holmes paced the drawing room, his arms folded tightly behind his back, while Helena sat still in the corner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Hughes brought in tea none of us touched. There's no time, Helena said at last. Pilcher is fragile. He may not know what he's walking into, but whoever took him does. Holmes nodded. They mean to complete something. Or undo it. Either way he is a piece to be played. And that garden, he paused, glancing toward the shuttered windows, it is no longer a passive place. We should have burned it, she murmured. All of it. Long ago. Not yet, Holmes said. Not before we understand what precisely we're dealing with. A sudden thud echoed from above, then a faint, scraping noise. We all turned toward the ceiling. The sound seemed to drift downward as though something, or someone, was moving through the upper levels of the manor. Watson, Holmes said crisply. The attic. I grabbed my revolver and together we mounted the grand staircase. The floorboards creaked under our steps as we ascended toward the topmost landing, the faint scent of dust and lavender oil growing stronger with each step. The attic door was ajar. Holmes pushed it open, revealing a large, dimly lit space cluttered with old trunks, oil paintings, and furniture draped in yellowing sheets. The moonlight spilled through a single round window, casting long, warped shadows across the floorboards. Then we saw him. Pilcher stood at the far end of the attic, facing an armoire with its mirror door cracked. He did not acknowledge our presence. His shirt was rumpled, his eyes glassy with stupor or trance. Mr. Pilcher, I called. You've been hurt, come with us. He didn't move. Holmes stepped forward, slowly as one might approach a wild animal. Mr. Pilcher, listen carefully. You are not in control. Someone is guiding you, someone who means you harm. Pilcher turned toward the mirror. I see them, he whispered. They're in the roots. And they speak. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Who speaks, Pilcher? A beat of silence. Then a whisper, she does. The mirror fogged, though the air was still. A coldness passed through the attic like the breath of a cellar door creaking open deep underground. She told me to return, Pilcher went on, voice thin as thread. She said, the garden needs blood. Or it won't stop remembering. Who is she? Holmes pressed, coming to stand beside him. But Pilcher's eyes rolled and he collapsed, body going limp. I caught him just before he struck the ground. Holmes knelt beside us, examining the side of Pilcher's neck. Another puncture, he muttered. Same as before. Dosed again. The person controlling him is using precise intervals, microdoses to induce suggestibility. I looked toward the mirror. In its cracked surface I thought I saw a woman's silhouette, hair plaited in a style 2 decades out of date, her eyes wide and glassy. But when I blinked the image was gone. We carried Pilcher back down and placed him in the sitting room, locking the doors behind us. Holmes didn't rest. Instead, he returned to the pink leather journal retrieved from the garden chamber and began flipping through the entries again with feverish intensity. There's a page missing, he said finally. Helena looked up. You're sure? Holmes nodded. Torn cleanly. It would have been the final page. Perhaps the conclusion of whatever ritual these notes describe, or its undoing. And who would want to hide that? I asked. Holmes turned his eyes toward the hearth, where the fire had long gone cold. Someone who fears the ritual's failure more than its consequences. A heavy silence settled in the room. Then Holmes straightened. We returned to the garden. Before midnight. Why midnight? Helena asked. Because rituals rarely wait for convenience, Holmes said. And the roses, those unnatural roses, have been cultivated by someone with intent. That intent will reach its crescendo tonight. And we must be present when it does. Chapter 12, The Petals Close at Midnight. The garden was a different world by night. The pale moon cast long silver rays over the twisting hedgerows, and the roses, those deep crimson aberrations, seemed to glow with an inner pulse as though drawing breath. Holmes walked ahead of us, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the overgrown paths. I followed with Helena, who clutched her coat tightly against the cold. Mrs. Hughes had remained behind to watch over Pilcher, still unconscious but murmuring occasionally in his sleep, snatches of verse, repeated names, fragments of something deeper than madness. Holmes paused before the stone arch that led into the central garden. Its iron gate had rusted nearly shut, but someone, recently, had pried it open. Mud still clung to the hinges. There, he said, pointing to fresh footprints in the damp earth. 2 sets. One small, light-footed. The other, larger. Well, possibly Pilcher, but more likely, our unknown gardener. The deeper we moved into the garden, the thicker the roses grew. They curled around statues, climbed over benches, and wove themselves into the trellis like veins through flesh. A narrow path led us back to the central greenhouse. Glass panels darkened by moss and dirt, vines pressed tight against the inside as if straining to burst free. Holmes raised his hand. Wait. From within came a flicker of movement, a shadow pacing. A woman's shape, unmistakable in outline. We ducked low beneath the windowsill, listening. A voice drifted through the cracked pane. Female. Low, smooth, tinged with something ancient and eerie. Root to root. Petal to petal. The cycle must complete. Holmes signaled silently and pushed open the greenhouse door. It creaked on its hinges as we stepped inside. The interior was a jungle. Massive rose bushes arched over trellises and choked the corners. The glass ceiling let in the moonlight, casting the entire space in a cold luminescence. At the center stood a stone pedestal, once a birdbath perhaps, now filled with what looked disturbingly like ash and petals. And before it, facing away, stood the woman. Her hair was silver blonde, plaited tightly. Her white dress shimmered with dew. But when she turned, Helena gasped audibly. "Clarissa," she whispered. The woman smiled, a smile untouched by years. Her skin was smooth, too smooth. Her eyes, however, were dead. "I told you I'd return," she said softly. Holmes stepped forward. "You are not Clarissa Halberd." "No," she replied. "But she allowed me to wear her face. A small gift after so much time." Helena backed away. What are you?" "A memory. A root. A curse spoken in love and sealed in grief. I was born in the garden when Clarissa bled on the altar. And I've waited, long enough." "Waited for what?" I asked, though my hand gripped the revolver in my coat. "To finish what was started. The garden must be fed again. Or else it turns inward. Devours the house, the family, the bloodline that planted me." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You manipulated Pilcher. He was a seed, nothing more. He followed the roots I laid long ago. And the murders?" Holmes's voice was low and sharp. The woman tilted her head. "Not murders. Sacrifices. You must understand the difference. They were chosen. One for guilt. One for betrayal. And the last, for memory." "Who is the last?" Helena asked, voice trembling. The woman's gaze landed on her. "You, dearest." The greenhouse groaned, vines shifting. The roses turned toward us as if drawn by her voice. Holmes moved swiftly, flinging a vial from his coat pocket onto the altar. It exploded in a flash of white smoke, sending up a choking plume. "Now, Watson," he barked. I grabbed Helena's arm, dragging her back through the doorway as Holmes followed. The woman screamed, not in pain but in fury. Her voice echoed through the night like wind through crypts. The roses recoiled, hissing as we stumbled from the greenhouse. We ran blindly past the hedgerows, through a cloud of petals torn loose by the rising wind. Only when the manor doors slammed shut behind us did we stop, gasping. Helena looked at Holmes, eyes wild. "What did you do?" "I disrupted the ritual," he said. "Temporarily. But it is not finished. And she is not gone." "Then how do we stop her?" I asked. Holmes turned to the staircase. "We burn the roots. But first, we find the true seed." Chapter 13, Beneath the Rose Altar. The morning sun broke through the mist like a reluctant promise, casting long shafts of gold across the battered remains of Halberd Manor. A hush had settled over the estate, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The events of the previous night had shaken us all, though none more than Helena, who now sat curled in an armchair by the library hearth, her expression vacant. Holmes stood by the tall windows, gazing out over the lawn where the roses still sprawled like red veins across the earth. He tapped a finger against his chin in silent thought. "She isn't truly a ghost," he said at last. "Nor wholly a woman. What we saw last night was a construct, memory-given form, anchored by blood, ritual, and a very specific location." "The greenhouse," I said. "And that altar." Holmes nodded. "A conduit. But it's more than that. That altar was not simply decorative. It was the foundation. There's something buried beneath it, something old, something Clarissa and perhaps even the original Halberds knew to fear." Helena's voice emerged in a whisper. "Clarissa used to speak of what grows beneath. I thought it poetry, a turn of phrase. But now—" Holmes turned from the window. It was literal. Within the hour, Holmes had summoned the estate's gardener, an aging man named Ellis who had worked the grounds long before the current family moved in. With reluctant hands and wary glances, he guided us back to the greenhouse, this time by daylight. The interior had changed. The plants seemed subdued, the air heavier, damp with an almost fungal humidity. The stone altar stood as we had left it, but the ash within had hardened as if scorched into place. "I remember this used to be something else entirely," Ellis muttered, squinting. "Before the roses took over. Long time ago, this was a mausoleum." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A family tomb?" The old man nodded. The Halberds were never buried in the local parish. Always right here, beneath this very soil. Rumor was they brought something back from the east, something they weren't meant to. Seeds, tinctures, spells maybe. "And the altar?" I asked. "It covered the old crypt entrance. I sealed it myself, Miss Clarissa's request. Said no one should ever go down again." Holmes crouched before the base of the pedestal, brushing away soil with his gloved fingers. Soon the rim of a rusted iron ring appeared. "She was right about one thing," Holmes said. "No one should have." With Ellis's help, we unearthed the stones around the altar base and pried them loose. Beneath lay a narrow stone shaft, descending steeply into blackness. A sickly sweet scent wafted upward, rot, clove, and something disturbingly sweet, like overripe fruit left to ferment. "Holmes lit à lanterne." "I shall go first," he said and disappeared down the steps. I followed, lantern in hand, and Helena brought up the rear, braver now in daylight yet pale as chalk. The staircase led us to a stone chamber lined with coffins, some ornate, others little more than rough wooden boxes. Vines had breached the crypt, curling across the floor and wrapping themselves lovingly around the old caskets. In the center lay a circle etched into the stone, filled with dried petals and dark stains. At its center, a small urn sat on a plinth. Holmes knelt beside it. "The root," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "A seed vessel, likely ancient. The kind once used in burial rituals in Southeast Asia. It would have held soil from a sacred mountain, perhaps ashes too. The roses, they didn't simply grow. They were bred." "And the woman?" Helena whispered. "Born from it. Or bound to it. Either way, she cannot exist without this." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a flask of clear liquid. "Nitric acid," he said simply. "No incantation?" I asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Science often plays the role of exorcist." As he poured the acid onto the urn, it hissed violently. Smoke erupted in great curling plumes, and the vines recoiled from the stone with audible shrieks, slithering back like wounded snakes. From above, a terrible wail echoed down the shaft, Clarissa's voice in agony and rage. Then silence. Utter, oppressive silence. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. "There. The seed is dead." Helena exhaled, her hands trembling. "So she's gone." "For now," Holmes said. "But roots run deep, Miss Halberd. And some flowers bloom again." Chapter 14. The Ashes Speak Twice. It was late afternoon when we emerged from the crypt, blinking into the sickly orange light. The greenhouse stood quiet now, no whispering vines, no unseen stirrings in the corners. The oppressive presence that had haunted its every pane of glass had lifted, though not entirely vanished. Holmes closed the iron trapdoor behind him and replaced the heavy stones. He gave no grand pronouncements, only a thin, grim line of satisfaction on his lips. "Rituals are curious things, Watson," he said as we walked back toward the manor. "They can be broken, but not erased. The memory of them clings like smoke in old velvet." Inside, Helena had collapsed into one of the high-backed chairs in the study, a shawl drawn around her shoulders. She looked younger now but also hollowed, like a shell left too long in the tide. "I thought it would end with her," she murmured. Clarissa. But I feel as if something is still watching. Holmes poured her a small glass of brandy, pressing it gently into her hand. What watches may simply be the mind seeking shapes in shadow. But you are not wrong to feel unfinished. There is still a question I have yet to answer. He walked over to the mantelpiece, where a single photograph had stood untouched throughout the chaos. A picture of Clarissa, younger, holding a crimson rose against her breast. Her expression was one of defiant serenity, though her eyes held something sharper. A knowing. A warning. Holmes removed the frame and opened the back. Inside, tucked behind the cardboard, was a sliver of paper. Well hidden, he said. Clarissa didn't want this found by just anyone. He read silently, his brows furrowing. Then he passed it to me. The ash must fall where the root once clung. The blood is the key. She cannot rest until it is returned. The curse is not mine, it was sown long before me. I merely watered it. A confession? I asked. An instruction, Holmes replied. Clarissa believed herself a steward of something ancient, dangerous but necessary. She feared it, yet obeyed it. And now she is dead, the ritual broken, but something remains unfinished. Helena's hands trembled. You think she's not truly gone? I think she made sure she could not be forgotten, Holmes said. There's one place we haven't yet examined. The music room. Where this all began. The Manor's music room was a decaying cathedral of echoes. Dust hung in shafts of light from the tall windows, and the grand piano stood silent in the corner, its lid propped open like a yawning mouth. Holmes moved toward the far wall, where a crimson curtain hung across a recess. It had once framed a harpsichord, Helena told us, but now stood empty. With a swift motion, Holmes drew it back. Behind it was a fresco, faded but unmistakable. A garden. But not one of Edenic beauty. This was thorned, overgrown, riddled with writhing vines. And at its center, a robed figure knelt before a stone urn. Holmes stepped closer, his fingers tracing the etched outlines. This, he whispered, is older than the house. A reproduction of something, perhaps a vision or an ancestral record. But why here? I asked. Because this room was the heart of her spell. Not the greenhouse. Not the crypt. This room fed the memory. The music, the curtain. He turned to Helena. Tell me, did your aunt ever play this piano? She shook her head. No. Never. She said the music was not for us. Holmes pressed a few keys. A low, dissonant chord echoed out, and suddenly the curtain twitched. Not from the wind. Something behind it had shifted. Holmes reached behind the fresco and pulled. A soft click echoed. A hidden panel slid open. Inside was a second urn, smaller, blackened with soot. Coiled around it was a vine, still alive despite the lack of sunlight. Holmes looked to Helena. This is the ash she met. The last of it. The seed that must return to the soil. Helena stepped forward slowly. And if we don't? He met her gaze. Then the roots grow again. And next time they will not whisper, they will consume. Without another word, she lifted the urn from the cavity, her hands steady now. Holmes nodded. Come. We end this at the place it began. Chapter 15. Return to the soil. The twilight mist hung low as we stepped into the gardens once more, the urn swaddled in thick velvet and cradled gently in Helena's arms. The air had grown colder, the scent of moss and wilted leaves more pungent than before. The dying light bled through the tree branches, casting broken shadows across the path like fingers of a sleeping giant. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting a pale, flickering glow. I followed close behind, and Helena trailed us silently as though under a spell. There was a finality to her movements, each step weighed by purpose. She said nothing, but her face bore the same iron resolve I had once seen in grieving women at gravesides, too proud to weep, too burdened to retreat. We reached the greenhouse for the second time that day, though now it looked more like a mausoleum than a place of growth. Its windows no longer shimmered with unnatural life, but stood cold and cracked, the vines within stilled as though in mourning. Holmes paused before entering, placing a gloved hand on the frame. You remember the location? He asked softly. Helena nodded. Under the rose bed. The oldest one. Inside, the glass panels moaned as wind passed across their edges. Holmes's boots crunched over dried soil and broken petals as he led us to the eastern quadrant. The rose bed there was withered, blackened stems and thornless branches sagged toward the earth. No scent of roses lingered. Only the stench of damp decay. Without a word, Holmes knelt and began to dig with his bare hands. The soil gave way easily as if expecting them. Soon the edge of a stone box emerged, weathered and moss-covered. He cleared it gently, brushing away the clinging dirt. "This is it," he said. Helena approached and, without prompting, lowered the urn into the hollow cavity. As it touched the stone, the air in the greenhouse seemed to shift. A low vibration hummed through the glass panes, subtle but undeniable, like a sigh released from beneath the roots of the world. Holmes stood. "Now the soil. Cover it." She did, scooping handfuls of earth back into the pit, her fingers stained black. I could see her hands trembling now, not from fear but something more profound. A letting go. When the final layer was in place, Helena remained crouched over the site for a moment longer. Her eyes were shut. She whispered something beneath her breath, too soft for us to hear. Then it was done. We turned to leave, but as we reached the door, a sudden crack echoed from behind us. The rosebush, lifeless only moments before, had moved. A single green shoot had emerged from the bed. We froze. It rose slowly, curling upward in a spiral. At its tip, a bud unfurled. And there, blooming in the dying light, was a single rose, blood-red, vibrant, full of impossible life. Helena gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Holmes, however, did not flinch. "A symbol," he murmured. "The cycle fulfilled. Not a curse, but memory returned to its rightful place." I approached the bloom cautiously. "Is it safe?" Holmes gave a rare smile, somber but certain. "So long as it is left undisturbed." We exited the greenhouse and sealed the door behind us. The mist thickened, cloaking the building once more in silence. Back inside the manor, Helena sat once more in the study, her shawl discarded now. The light from the hearth danced across her face, and for the first time since we had arrived, there was a warmth in her expression not born from fire. "What will become of this place?" she asked. "That is your decision," Holmes said. "But I suggest you let it sleep. Houses such as this remember." She nodded. "I will leave it to the earth." Holmes stood. "Then our task is finished." But as we stepped into the night once more, I could not help but glance back at the greenhouse. Its windows reflected only the stars, but behind the glass I thought I saw the rose glowing still. Chapter 16. The Gardener's Confession. We left Ravenwood Manor under a sky thick with cloud, but Holmes, rather than returning directly to London, requested one final stop in the nearby village. His mind, though seemingly satisfied with the events within the greenhouse, remained quietly alert. His gaze distant, his fingers tapping an invisible rhythm against his thigh as we drove. "Something troubles you?" I ventured. "Something nags," he murmured. "The rose bloomed, yes. The urn was returned. But no ghost makes mischief without help." I blinked. "You believe someone assisted the phenomenon?" "I believe someone exploited it," he said simply. "And I believe I know who." We arrived at a modest stone cottage nestled at the village's edge. The garden out front was neat, almost too perfect, hedges trimmed into uniform domes, flowerbeds symmetrical to a fault. An old man in a wide-brimmed hat was pruning a hydrangea with a pair of silver shears. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Crowthorne, I presume?" The man looked up, blinking behind spectacles. "That I am. I'm Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've just come from Ravenwood." A flicker of recognition crossed Crowthorne's face, followed quickly by wariness. "I've not set foot there in over a year." Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet, your mark is everywhere." Crowthorne stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Holmes stepped closer, his voice soft but piercing. "You were the last gardener before the estate was shuttered. You knew of the urn, its placement in the rosebed, the strange vitality of the plants above it. You also knew Helena's mind was beginning to unravel from grief. A dangerous combination." "I tended the soil, that's all," Crowthorne muttered. "The urn was placed long before I arrived." Holmes tilted his head. "But it was you who cultivated that particular patch, ensuring the rose thrived. You who added certain agents to the soil, nitrates, perhaps, or organic accelerants, to enhance the uncanny growth. And when Helena began to notice the unnatural blooms, you let her believe they were haunted." Crowthorne's hand tightened on the shears. Holmes continued, "Perhaps you meant no harm. Perhaps you believed it to be kind. Feeding her belief that her husband watched over the garden, taming her sorrow into something she could bear." The old man said nothing. "But grief," Holmes said darkly, "has a long tail. You should have stopped when she became obsessed. When she refused to leave the manor. When she heard voices." Crowthorne's voice cracked. "She wouldn't listen. She said the roses were speaking to her, that they bloomed in his voice. I tried to uproot them once. She wept for hours. After that, I left them be." I thought, maybe she needed it. Holmes nodded. And the curtain in the guest room? I don't know about that, Crowthorne said quickly, but Holmes's stare pinned him. You used it as a prop. A subtle encouragement. Slashed it perhaps so she'd think the house itself was warning her. Now the old man sank onto the wooden step. The shears clattered to the stone beside him. Because her piece has only just begun, Holmes replied. Let it rest. The garden will wither in time, and with it, the last breath of illusion. He folded his arms and closed his eyes. Behind us, the village grew small in the distance. And somewhere beyond the hills, the rose in the greenhouse swayed alone, its petals still catching the light of a vanished sun. Chapter 17. Shadows from the Frame. The journey back to London passed in reflective silence. Holmes seemed to have retreated once more into his private realm of thought, his profile turned to the glass as the countryside slid past in blurred hues of green and gold. I let him be, content to process the case in my own mind, though as ever certain fragments refused to settle comfortably. Late in the afternoon as we neared Baker Street, Holmes stirred. You recall the portrait above the hearth in the Ravenwood drawing-room? He asked suddenly. Of Lord Altham? Certainly. Quite a formidable rendering. Holmes nodded. Formidable, yes. And altered. I frowned. Altered. It struck me as odd, he murmured. The angle of the shoulders, the thickness of the frame. Something about it suggested tampering. But what motive would there be to tamper with a portrait? I asked. Holmes's eyes glittered. That is precisely what I intend to determine. We alighted at Baker Street only long enough for Holmes to retrieve a small satchel of tools and a coiled length of twine. Without explanation, he hailed a cab and directed it not to our lodgings, but to the home of Inspector Lestrade. The inspector, surprised but ever obliging, welcomed us in. I trust you have something more than idle curiosity this time, Holmes? He asked, offering a cigar that Holmes declined with a distracted wave. I require access to the Ravenwood Manor once more, Holmes said briskly. Tonight, if possible. There is one final matter to resolve. Lestrade looked exasperated but intrigued. That case again? I thought it done and dusted. Only nearly, Holmes replied. One thread remains, fine, delicate, and possibly threaded through a gilded frame. Lestrade sighed and scratched his chin. Very well. I'll send word to the local constable to expect us. That evening, as dusk cloaked the manor in deepening blue, we returned to Ravenwood. The estate was quiet. No sign of Helena or the caretakers. Holmes moved through the corridors with the silent certainty of a man retracing a mental map. We entered the drawing-room just as the light from the western window began to fade. He stood before the portrait of Lord Altham, studying it with narrowed eyes. The nobleman's gaze, forever cast downward as if inspecting a lesser soul, glinted under the oil varnish. Holmes reached into his bag and withdrew a slim penknife. Watson, the chair if you please. I obliged, pulling it beneath the mantel. Holmes stepped up and, with careful precision, slid the blade between the frame and canvas along the lower right corner. There was a faint click. He withdrew the knife and inserted the tip of the twine into the seam. Gently, slowly he tugged, and a portion of the frame popped free like a hidden panel. Behind the canvas, folded in quarters and tucked flat against the wall, was a yellowing envelope. Lestrade let out a low whistle. Holmes carefully extracted it and stepped down, handling it as one might an ancient relic. The wax seal, though cracked, bore the unmistakable impression of the Altham family crest. With a glance for our approval, Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, ink faded but legible. To whoever finds this, I've been a coward. I could not live with the shame of my brother's death, nor the truth of the rose garden. It was I who argued with him the night he vanished. I found the shattered glass near the greenhouse steps. I buried the urn, believing it would bring Helena peace. But the house has changed. It groans at night. The shadows flicker in ways that mock light. And I feel I am being watched from within the very walls I once called sanctuary. I do not know if I am mad. But if you are reading this, know that the ghost is mine, not hers. And it will not let me leave. I whispered. Frederick Altham. Holmes nodded gravely. The brother. Presumed to have died abroad. But this suggests otherwise. Then the ghost was his creation? Lestrade asked. More likely his guilt, Holmes replied softly. A haunting of the soul rather than the supernatural. The silence that followed was reverent. Holmes replaced the letter in its envelope and tucked it into his coat. We will give it to Helena, he said. She deserves to know the full truth, even if the truth is burdened with pain. We exited the manor once more, stepping into the crisp air of twilight. A single light flickered in the greenhouse behind us. This time Holmes did not look back. Chapter 18. The Final Petal. The morning after our return from Ravenwood, a soft drizzle hung over London like a curtain of grey silk. Holmes, perched by the fireplace with his fingers tented beneath his chin, had not spoken for some time. The envelope containing Frederick Altham's confession lay open on the table beside him, the cracked wax seal now fully broken. Helena Altham arrived just after 10. She was composed, her dark gloves damp from the rain, her expression unreadable as Holmes offered her tea and motioned for her to sit. I noticed the faintest tremble in her fingers as she accepted the cup. "You found something," she said. Holmes nodded slowly. "We found your uncle's writing, Miss Altham, hidden behind the portrait above the hearth. A letter. His final thoughts." She inhaled, the sound soft but jagged, like paper tearing. Holmes handed her the envelope.